Research in language acquisition often specifically focuses on monolingual children. This is because when we're trying to understand the learning process, the psychological mechanisms behind language acquisition, we want to see them in the simplest possible scenario, without the conflicting factors of additional languages. But it is important that we also study bilingual and multilingual acquisition, as this is actually the norm for most of the world's population. It is enough to mention that while there are around 200 countries in the world, there are over 6,000 languages spoken. This means that in each country you will hear a lot more than just one language. Usually there will be one state language or a few of them, and then people will speak other languages for various reasons, sometimes as the language of their smaller community, sometimes for professional reasons and educational reasons, sometimes for religious and cultural reasons, and sometimes simply because each of their parents come from a different language background. Either way, for the great majority of the world's population, multilingualism is just a fact of life. When we talk about bilingual language acquisition, there are three typical scenarios which can lead to a person being fluent in more than one language. The first is simultaneous bilingualism. This is when a child acquires more than one language from birth. For example, if each of the parents speaks a different language at home, the baby will learn both languages from the very beginning. On the other hand, sequential bilingualism means that also both languages are acquired in early childhood, but not both from birth at the same time. Typically, the first language will be the home language, the family language, and then later on, for example, when the child goes to school or to kindergarten, they learn the community language. In both simultaneous and sequential bilingual acquisition, both languages are acquired early on, and so we expect native-like competence in those languages. The third scenario is when first language is acquired from birth, and then second language is acquired later in life, after puberty. For example, when people move to a different country as adults, or when they learn a second language in school or university. Still, not all children who grow up in multilingual contexts end up bilingual. Certain conditions have to be met for that to happen. First of all, the children have to hear at least 25% approximately of all their language input in the other language. If they hear the language less than that, they will not learn it. Second of all, they absolutely need to have the opportunity to interact in a language. If they only hear a language on the radio or on TV, but never have real life human interaction in that language, and they have no need to use it, the outcome will also not be bilingualism. And finally, the community attitudes towards the child's languages are also important. If one of the languages that the child speaks is perceived as lower status, then the child might actually, during the course of development, stop using it. This sometimes happens in immigrant contexts where children might be encouraged to stop speaking their family language and aspire to be like monolingual native speakers. A commonly observed phenomenon in children acquiring more than one language from early on is code switching. That means that children often mix the languages that they are learning, sometimes even within the same sentence. Some people believe this means that children are confused, that perhaps they don't know the difference between the two languages and they are learning them as if it was one language. They are worried that such children might be at a disadvantage and might actually struggle to learn either of the two languages really well. But is that really the case? Let's look at some examples of code switching. The type of code switching that is particularly relevant in this respect is the intrasentential code switching. That is, the switching that occurs when languages are mixed inside one sentence. The examples you see here come from a boy acquiring English and Spanish. The bits in orange are in Spanish and the bits in black are in English. When you look at these two sentences, try to think about what the English words have in common. School bus, stop sign, line reader. What types of words are they? And are they similar in meaning or use? Indeed, all of them are related to school. They are the vocabulary used at school, and so we can probably guess that this child is learning English at school and Spanish at home. Moreover, these are content words. You will notice that the grammatical structure of the sentence is in Spanish. In fact, when we examine examples of code switching in bilingual children, we find that the switching is not at all random. It's not just random mixing of different language bits. Even in intrasentential switches, that is, within one sentence, the switches observe linguistic constraints. So usually one language provides the foundation, the grammar, the sort of base of the sentence, and the other language only some of the content words. Or the switches occur across morpheme boundaries. So you might add an English plural to an Arabic word, for example. So the switches are structurally sound. Second of all, the switches are often pragmatically sensible, meaning that they're context dependent. So for example, the vocabulary that is mostly used in the context of one language is used in that language, like the school vocabulary that we just saw. Just like you might talk about linguistics using mostly English words. But also, children try to be listener sensitive when they can. So children usually are more likely to do code switching when they know that the listeners understand both languages. Again, they're not doing it randomly. Furthermore, research has found that even newborns are able to distinguish between different languages. So it is unlikely that children learning two languages don't realize that or mix them up as if they were the same language. Different languages have different phonological patterns, and babies are very good at distinguishing them. Code switching is also often observed in adult speakers. It is actually common in adult bilinguals and is in fact a marker of fluency. That is, you need to be proficient in a language to be able to perform code switching. So, code switching in bilingual children is unlikely to be evidence that the languages are mixed up. Rather, it is simply the result of the fact that these children are learning two vocabularies. And so naturally, they take longer to complete both of them. But they do eventually catch up. And apart from the vocabulary, the acquisition is not negatively affected by bilingualism, and their cognitive development is not negatively affected either. In fact, many studies found a possible advantage for bilingual children in terms of their overall cognitive development. It's been found that they might be better at some tasks requiring focused attention and dealing with conflicting information. It is possible that that's because they have extra experience dealing with two competing linguistic systems in their mind. Second language acquisition is quite a different process from simultaneous and sequential bilingual acquisition in early childhood. We talk about second language acquisition when referring to the process of learning a second language after puberty in adulthood, or learning a second language even from childhood, but without enough input or enough interaction that could allow for native-like competence. For example, this is the situation in a classroom where there isn't enough input and enough natural interaction to lead to native-like competence, but still the language can be learned. And that's the biggest difference between simultaneous and sequential bilingual acquisition on the one hand and second language acquisition on the other, is that when both languages are acquired from early childhood, they usually lead to native-like competence. However, with second language acquisition, this is usually not the case, and learners stop at some point where their grammar and pronunciation are still not at a native level, and they do not develop beyond that point. We call this fossilization, and this is what foreign accent is, for example, or persistent grammatical errors even in very proficient speakers. However, regardless of the way that the language was acquired, and regardless of some non-native aspects, as long as the speaker can successfully communicate in both their languages to the extent that they need to, with fluency and proficiency, they count as bilinguals.